Hello, hello. Thank you very much for joining us today for SCVO's latest policy webinar on the implications of the Scottish budget on the sector and the economy. Happy New Year to you all. I'm sure you're feeling extremely fresh and ready to go if this is your second day back, especially after the break. Hopefully you'll be feeling more energized after this if you're not already. So I'm Paul Bradley. I work for the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, and we're the national membership organisation for the voluntary sector in Scotland. And I'm coming to you from Glasgow today. It's probably just like you, my first full week back, and somehow I seem to have landed myself with the second webinar of the week that I'm chairing. So yesterday's was extremely lively, and I'm hoping that today's a little bit more of a gentle pace, but really looking forward to hearing some of your questions to our panel who have joined us today. Before we get started, I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping.
So we just moved a couple of things.
People, please ensure that they have muted their microphones as well, just because we're getting a little bit of feedback at this end, and that really helps to ensure that everyone can hear the panel when they start speaking. So today's session will run until 11 AM at the latest, and we'll kick off with contributions from our panel members and then move to a Q&A, which will take us up to 11. Please do use the chat function to submit your questions, and you can find the function at the bottom of the Zoom window and just click chat, and do get those questions in throughout the course of the session. Don't wait just to the Q&A. We won't have lots of time for questions, probably around 15 minutes, but don't worry, if your questions aren't picked up, then I will go out to the panelists after the event and ensure that we can get a response to you on those. We're also recording the panel and Q&A. The recording will only capture those who are speaking, so not those who have joined the call today. And we've been trialing using live captions on Zoom for webinars, and you can enable captions if needed by selecting the captions in the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom window. But I must warn you, it's not the best because it's automated and it doesn't pick up an Essex accent very good. And never does it pick up a Scottish accent very good either. So yeah, it's not the best, but that function is available if you need it. So today we're going to explore the implications of the Scottish budget on the voluntary sector and the economy. I find it really difficult myself trying to get my head around the Scottish budget every year. I've been at SCVO for around 6 years now, and kind of dread it when it comes around again and try to work out what it means, not just for SCVO, but for the wider voluntary sector. I'm delighted that we have the opportunity to hear from and engage with our panel of experts this morning, who will come to this discussion with some different hats on, and I'm sure will provide some very valuable information to us all. Today is designed to help us understand the wider context, unpick it, and help you understand how your own work is situated within that. So we're joined by Mairi Spowage, Director of the Fraser of Allander Institute, who will kick us off by looking at how the budget impacts on the wider economic picture for Scotland and what this might mean for charities. As I said, I find the budget extremely complex, so I'm delighted that we have Mairi on hand to break it down for us today. We're also joined by my colleague in the policy team, Sheghley Ogilvie, who's Policy and Public Affairs Officer at SCVO, who will look at how the budget directly impacts on voluntary organisations. And we're also joined by Yule, Financial Advisor at COSLA, the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, who will run through how the budget will impact on local government and how this might affect voluntary organisations as well. So thank you all for joining today's call, and also to Shelley as well for organising this. So without further ado, we'll go to Mairi first for around 15 minutes, and I will let you know when it approaches 15 minutes because we are tight on time today. Remember to put your questions in the chat box. Don't wait for the Q&A to start, and do let me know who you would like that question directed to. So over to you, Mairi.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for inviting me to speak today. So, I mean, the overall message from the budget and the accompanying economic forecasts, which are very important now for the Scottish budget because of the level of devolution we have for tax receipts. So it's not just that the Scottish Government has to say how it's going to spend a block of money. We also need to look at the forecast produced by the Scottish Fiscal Commission to work out how much we're going to raise in various receipts, particularly income tax, to understand how much money we have to spend in total for the devolved government. And the overall message was really about inflation, the impact it's having on the overall economy, and therefore the health, I suppose, of the tax receipts that we can expect to raise and the costs we can expect to incur as a society over the next wee while, given we're going into a difficult economic period, but also the impact that it's having on the costs of delivering services which are acute. And those are obviously in things like energy costs and input costs, but primarily they're affecting public services in the form of public sector pay disputes, which were obviously ongoing. But if we take a bit of a step back and look at the economic outlook that was presented by the Fiscal Commission and therefore underpinned the Scottish Government's budget, it wasn't good. That was broadly expected. Like the Office for Budget Responsibility set out in the autumn statement at the UK level, the SFC now think we are in a recession that started sort of in Q3, and that this is likely to last probably a year and a half. Again, they expect that this is going to be quite a shallow recession by recent standards, so it's not going to be the sort of recession we saw in 2008. It's going to be more similar probably to the one that we saw in the early 90s. So it's going to be quite long but quite shallow. But we should see the forecast for the recession in the context of what the Fiscal Commission expect to happen after that, which is very slow, sluggish growth, even as we recover. So at the moment, they're expecting that we won't get to that pre-pandemic level of growth. So, that sort of end of 2019 level of the size of the economy until the second half of 2025 now. And that's only just getting back to where we were pre-pandemic. So even if you can look at the fact we're going to return to growth in a year and a half as good news, it's not really, because it's pretty sluggish, pretty poor growth by historic standards. What this means, I suppose, for households and how people are going to feel over the next wee while is that households are going to see the biggest real terms fall in their disposable income since the records began for Scotland in 1998. So people are going to really feel it, going to really feel the pinch, as we all know, with the cost of living crisis. But it's certainly borne out in the aggregate figures now and what the Fiscal Commission expect is going to happen to the Scottish economy over the next 18 months. So as we emerge from recession, as has been a feature of the Scottish economy, particularly since significant tax devolution in 2016, they expect the Scottish economy will grow less quickly than the UK as a whole. Now, there are a number of reasons for that. The main one is because of demography, and the outlook for our population is not as healthy, if one wants to see population growth, of course, as the UK as a whole. But obviously, but also our productivity has lagged the UK and is generally forecast to lag the UK over the next 5 years into the medium term. So the outlook is not good. And there's not much optimism, I think, about how we will then recover into the future. In terms of the headlines from the actual budget itself and the announcements that were made, what made the headlines were the decisions on income tax, of course. The fact that the Scottish Government departed somewhat from its manifesto for 2021, although obviously there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then, and increased the higher rate of tax from 41 to 42 pence, and the additional rate of tax from 46 to 47 pence. This in aggregate is raising £129 million, which isn't a huge amount of money in the scheme of things, to be honest, but it is a very small proportion of taxpayers that are in those higher bands of tax. And whilst obviously people may think that people who are earning over £40,000 should pay more tax, we've got to remember it is a small amount of people, and there's only so much burden one can place upon that group of taxpayers. Also, as has been the trend in recent years, the Scottish Government have frozen thresholds in cash terms. So more and more people are being brought into those higher rates of tax as earnings increase. And that's accelerated extensively in the latest set of forecasts because of high inflation. So more and more people are coming into those higher rates of tax. And it means that sort of 10 years ago, there's sort of 10% of the Scottish taxpayer base were in the higher rate or above. Now it's almost 20%. So more and more people are going into those higher rates of tax and therefore going to be paying significantly more tax than if they were in the rest of the UK. There were a number of budget transparency issues about the way that the Scottish Government presented the budget on the 15th of December. And I've no doubt that Derek will want to cover some of this in his contribution. There was controversy over whether the government should be comparing what they set out on the 15th of December with what they set out last December for last year's budget, to look at comparisons over time. This is a perennial problem, but it was particularly acute this year because of the amount of in-year movement we saw with various announcements and, for example, the support that the Scottish Government gave to local authorities to help with public sector pay deals during the year. So it meant that we had, unfortunately, a sort of a more exaggerated form of the, what is the real position for areas like local government in reality. And I think that despite the announcement by the Scottish Government that the funding for local government was over £500 million more than had been announced in the previous year, there's no doubt that a lot of that money is already committed into things like honouring pay deals that have been agreed during 22-23. And the reality is that the settlement for local government is very tight. There was also a bit of a tale, in my view, of kicking the can down the road with various difficult issues. Departing from the usual convention, there was no public sector pay policy presented for 23-24. Now, this is obviously because the Scottish Government and others in the public sector are still in dispute about various public sector pay deals for 22-23, never mind for 23-24. But personally, I was surprised that there wasn't anything presented. So, we don't know when that will be presented and what it might look like. But given the size of the public sector pay bill is over 20 billion, so it's a huge proportion of the Scottish budget, this represents a huge amount of uncertainty about the funding position for 23-24 and what might actually happen to certain areas of spending if, in fact, the public sector pay bill is greater than is currently being assumed in the figures. We've seen what happens during 22-23 to reallocate funding in order to fund pay deals. And it'd be really interesting to hear from people who are here about the impact that might have had on the services you deliver. And within a year, never mind about next year. So I guess the worry would be that will be necessary next year again, given that we're not sure of the provision that has been made for public sector pay deals in the 23-24 budget at the moment. So that's a bit of a concern. There was also little detail on the funding that has been allocated to the National Care Service, which I know will be of interest to some of you here in terms of the impact it may have on the services that you deliver. There's been a lot of coverage, and we've written a lot extensively in the Institute about the uncertainty over how much the National Care Service is going to cost, and indeed what it actually is and what it's actually going to be responsible for. And there was little more detail in the budget about that, despite significant interest and, to be fair, criticism from parliamentary committees about the transparency that the government's showing in this. There was also supposed to be a plan for public service reform to help us deal with some of these challenges alongside the budget. That was not published. We don't know when it will be published. I think the commitment was now in the year, which in civil service speak can mean pretty much anything. So no more detail on how these changes to the way we deliver public services will be made. Will it mean managing down the public sector headcount? There hasn't been much sign of that yet, but I mean, how is that going to happen in a way which ensures that outcomes for citizens aren't deteriorated? For me, and obviously thinking about this webinar, when I was reading what was presented in the budget, there was little mention of third sector considerations. I'll hear from Sheila in a minute, see if that's how you feel. We sort of anecdotally heard about services being under threat during the 22-23 reallocations of budget. You know, when you look at things that were targeted in the emergency budget review, such as mental health services or employability services, which we do a lot of work on, it would be good to hear if you feel those are under threat, given the way that funds were reallocated in 22-23, because my fear is, I suppose, that we may be in for that again in 23-24, given the uncertainty over public sector pay deals. So I'll probably stop there. I'm within my 15 minutes, Paul. Let you hand over.
Oh, you're the perfect panel member. Thank you so much for that, and that means more time for questions. If anyone does have any questions for Mairi, then do get them in the chat just now. We'll move on to our next speaker, and I think that actually kind of segues nicely into to Shelley's talk. Sheghley Ogilvie from SCVO, who will be covering how the budget directly impacts on the voluntary sector, and that outlook that you've just presented there, Mairi, is depressing, more depressing than last year's webinar that we held, which is, you know, absolutely, you know, really concerning. But Shelley, it'd be great to come to you now, just to kind of get a sense of what all this might mean for the voluntary sector in kind of the broadest of senses.
Thanks, Paul, and good morning, everyone. In my experience, it's difficult to truly understand the impact of the Scottish budget on the voluntary sector, and this year is no different. As we all know, the voluntary sector is hugely diverse, and as a result, organisations receive funding from many different Scottish Government departments. How funding flows to the sector from departments is not broken down, and so an overall picture of what the budget invests in the sector, and if this investment has increased or decreased, is not available. This picture is further complicated, as while some voluntary organisations are funded through government, funding is also received from third parties such as funders or other public bodies and local government. Each year, the sector gets $2 billion from the public sector. SCVO have called for action to be taken on funding transparency, and we welcome commitments in the budget to transparency around public finances, which would enable us to better understand funding flows to the sector and the impact of spending decisions. In the meantime, without a clear big picture of how the budget funds the sector, our budget analysis focuses on specific commitments within the budget, such as funding, fair work and energy, broad issues that will impact organisations across the sector. So today I'm going to start by discussing the third sector budget line. At 21.8 million in 23-24, the third sector budget line is just a small part of the government's overall investment in the sector. This budget funds SCVO and other voluntary sector infrastructure organisations and projects. During the Scottish budget debate in December, two MSPs, Jeremy Balfour and Alex Cole-Hamilton, challenged the Scottish Government for reducing voluntary sector funding in the budget by 4 million. And while we welcome MSPs challenging the government on voluntary sector funding, the third sector unit at the Scottish Government have confirmed our view that rather than a cut to voluntary sector funding, this £4 million is loan finance being recycled within the third sector budget line, and so it doesn't show as new fiscal spend in the budget. I think this is interesting for a few reasons. It demonstrates how complex the budget is. Even MSPs with experience of the budget mistook this as a budget cut. And while we have a figure, 21.8 million, what it means for organisations and programmes funded by the budget line is unclear. What it does show, however, is that the third sector budget line, the clearest proxy we have to measure government support for the sector, remains the same. There hasn't been an inflation-based or other uplift, and this might be a relief. Over the last few months, Deputy First Minister John Swinney has discussed the challenging economic outlook and turbulent financial context, and we've just heard more on that from Mairi. We've seen him try to balance the books for the current financial year by reallocating funding in 2 emergency budget responses. I think, however, that a standstill budget for the voluntary sector is a big disappointment, and I'm sure a lot of other people on the call agree. And while the spending review suggested that the third sector budget line would remain the same this year, Both the budget and the emergency budget reviews have seen some divergence from the spending review. So I'd hoped as a result that we might see some sort of uplift for the sector, both in this budget line and more widely. And just to give an example, if this budget line were to reach 27 million by 2026, as is planned in the spending review, that would still be a 29% cut in real terms since 2011, so pretty significant. Over the last year, SCVO have shared how years of underfunding, followed by COVID-19 and the running cost crisis, have created an unsustainable environment which threatens the voluntary sector. Standstill budgets aren't sustainable for voluntary organisations, their staff, volunteers, or the communities we work with. As an example, in the latest wave of the third sector tracker, 93% of organisations reported cost increases. For organisations concerned about their funding, the budget's likely to be a disappointment. Despite rising costs, there's no suggestion that the Scottish Government have budgeted for inflation-based uplifts in grant funding and contracts. Multi-year funding didn't feature in either the budget or the spending review, despite being widely recognised within Scottish Government and Parliament as a sensible approach to funding. And while we welcome the Deputy First Minister confirming the Government's support for a multi-year funding approach, this confirmation only came after a question about a 3-year pay deal for the sector from opposition MSP Jeremy Balfour. It's disappointing that positive rhetoric and agreement about the benefits of multi-year funding across Government and Parliament continues not to progress into action from Scottish Government. To create a sustainable sector, we need multi-year funding, but we also need the Scottish Government to go further. We need fair funding for the sector. And I worry that the Scottish Government don't recognise that fair funding is much broader than multi-year funding. Fair funding is a long-term, flexible, sustainable and accessible approach to funding. I do, however, welcome recognition in the budget that multi-year funding and fairer funding practice will be a priority for the Social Justice and Social Security Committee in the next year. Over the next year, SCVO will hold the Scottish Government to account on these issues. We'll be focusing on actions the Scottish Government could take to ensure that funding arrangements within voluntary organisations are fair, and we'll be interested in your experiences of fair funding. So what are some of the other big issues for the sector that are coming up over the next year? So fair work, pay and energy. And did the budget accommodate these? At SCVO, we believe that fair work for Scotland's voluntary sector workforce should be a priority. In the budget, John Swinney recognised paying higher wages is the biggest contribution the Scottish Government can make to helping people and families with rising costs. Over the last few months, both Scottish Government emergency budget responses recognised the impact of the cost of living crisis on public sector staff and took action to provide wage uplifts, particularly for the lowest paid. In the current financial year, the Scottish Government committed to 700 million in enhanced pay deals for public sector staff. As we all know, the voluntary sector also provides essential services and support, but action to ensure voluntary sector staff can receive pay increases equal to their public sector counterparts were not taken in either of the emergency budget responses or the budget. To put this in context, there are around 450,000 devolved public sector workers. The voluntary sector workforce is around 135,000 people. Similarly, despite the Scottish Government's ambitions to achieve fair work and broadening the Fair Work First criteria to include payment of the living wage, there were no commitments to support departments or local government to resource voluntary organisations to pay at least the real living wage. And that's an opportunity missed. Multi-year funding, inflation-based uplifts, grants and contracts that accommodate at least the living wage are all central to a sustainable sector, job and financial security for voluntary sector staff, supporting volunteers, and the Scottish Government's own fair work ambitions. On energy, a key contributor to rising costs for voluntary organisations, the UK Government is expected to halve its support for voluntary organisations' energy costs. While the price of gas has reduced, it may be months before energy bills reduce, if at all, so it's all very unpredictable. Over the next year, we'll push for the Scottish Government to invest in its bulk purchasing energy frameworks by negotiating new deals and for their energy frameworks to be reopened to voluntary organisations. So how did organisations in the sector react to the budget? Organisations across the sector welcomed the key aims of the 23-24 budget would be to eradicate child poverty, transform the economy to deliver net zero, and create sustainable public services. As reported by our colleagues at Third Force News, the sector also welcomes Scottish Budget commitments to progressive taxation, increased support for health, uprating all devolved benefits with the exception of the Scottish Child Payment, and 20 million to extend the Fuel and Security Fund. Overall, there seems to be consensus that while the budget contains some welcome commitments, it could have gone further to support the most vulnerable people and communities, eradicate poverty, and kickstart net zero. Voluntary organisations are central to these aims, and a lack of recognition, resources, and support will threaten our sector's contribution to them, as organisations across the sector struggle to keep the lights on, meet demand, support volunteers, uplift wages, and deliver quality outcomes. That's all from me. So I think Derek's up next.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Shelley. That's really, really helpful. And I think one of the things that we've been working on SCVO over the past year is really just keep pushing that message on fair funding and actually outlining what that means in all its different forms. And I think that going into this year, now we have more of those commitments from people like the Deputy First Minister is really trying to hold government to account on those promises. And I know for many on this call, you will have heard those promises already before in years gone by. And I think for this year, we need to look at how we can hold government to account each step of the way on those promises to ensure that they deliver. So hopefully you'll see more of that from SCVO over the coming years. Thanks very much for that, Shelley. We're going to move on to we're doing well for time today. We're going to move on to our final panel member, Derek Yule, from COSLA. 89% of voluntary organisations in Scotland are local, and latest SCVO data that's not been published yet estimates that more than 1.5 billion flows from local authorities to voluntary organisations annually. So that's up substantially from 1 billion in 2020, and those are only estimates, but most of that increase is through contracts. So clearly there's a significant link between local authorities and voluntary organisations, as we all know. It's great to have Derek on the call today to discuss some of this. So can we come to you now and to look at how this budget impacts on local government and how that might affect voluntary organisations over the coming year?
Thanks very much, Paul. I've got a short presentation here. We can just move to that just now. Hopefully it'll load okay. Everybody see the presentation okay?
Yes.
That's fine, thank you. It's always good somebody replies. I think maybe just a couple of, having listened to the introduction, the previous two speakers, maybe just a couple of things to say by way of introduction. I think firstly, Paul, you spoke about you've struggled to get your head around the Scottish Government budget. You're not alone in that by any manner of means. I've been sort of looking at this for a lot longer than you have, and probably I'm speaking as much in my previous life as Director of Resources at Highland Council before I retired a few years ago, and I'm still working part-time with COSLA now. But these issues have been around for a long time. I think working in a political environment, I think you always recognise the political spin that politicians will put around budget decisions, funding announcements. My personal view is that things have got increasingly challenging over the last decade. I would say, I think Mairi spoke, and Sheila too, I think in terms of budget transparency. I think, to be honest, the way that some of the budget announcements are made, it's misleading. I think it takes political spin to a new level, and hopefully I've got one or two examples in the presentation just to show where I think some of the difficulties arise. Now, Mairi's provided some of that wider context. I don't plan to really spend any time in this. I think people are well aware of the financial context. I suppose the only small benefit was the last bit there, that the UK autumn budget announced something like an extra 1.5 billion for Scotland as a result of some of the funding decisions in England. So I think the focus of my presentation will really be around the decisions that the Scottish Government has made in terms of presenting its budget. I think we do recognise that the funding challenges itself are difficult at all levels of the public sector. But I think my focus will be on how the Scottish Government has chosen to allocate resources. But first, as Mairi teed me up for this, I think just a little bit about some of the transparency issues. Now, since the budget was announced in December, it's fair to say that 32 councils have been challenging, querying some of the figures. We're aware that there were mistakes made in the announcement of the settlement for local government, and I've seen numerous emails flying back and forward over the last 4 weeks with councils individually and collectively challenging some of the questions. And this is one of the difficulties I think we have around understanding the Scottish Government budget, because funding comes from different government departments. There isn't one local government department within Scottish Government, unlike some of the other policy areas, and that in itself presents itself with some challenges. The numbers that are on the screen there in terms of the funding announcement at £12.4 billion, how it's been presented and what's COSLA believe is the actual budget reality. We believe that it only represents something like a 71 million cash increase once policy commitments are removed from the figures. So what I mean by that is, yes, there's additional money in the settlement, and government will present this as a cash uplift for the local government funding block, but because it includes funding for known commitments, which are largely driven by Scottish Government's own policy directives, it means that there's only 71 million additional cash available to councils. And as part of COSLA's lobbying document ahead of this Scottish Government budget, we recognised that the pressures that councils are facing currently were somewhere around about £1 billion. Now that included over £600 million of pressures for all the things we've spoken about earlier: inflation, energy, pay, increased demand for services, and some kind of provision for pay going forward. But it's worth noting that every 1% increase in pay costs around 100 million on a recurring basis. So you'll see, in the context of what we'd argue is basically a flat cash budget, that every percentage pay increase just adds to the pressures that councils are facing on an ongoing basis. I suspect capital's less of interest for people on this call, but I think it illustrates to me perfectly some of the misleading statements that are made for government. So capital funding announced 706 million is presented as an increase of 80 million over the previous base. So I don't know, you can do the maths as well as I can, but it's well over a 10% increase. But the reality is there's 80 million included for the expansion of free school meals for P6 and P7 pupils. Now, I'm not sitting here today criticising the policy. All I'm making the point is, well, actually, that's additional money, but it's additional money to deliver a Scottish Government policy. So the reality is, it's a flat cash funding settlement for councils at a time when we're seeing huge inflationary pressures on councils. I think I want to turn now to look at sort of the longer term pictures, because some of the challenges that councils are facing just now, like Sheila just spoken about for voluntary organisations, these are not new. They're probably exacerbated just now by the inflationary pressures on pay and energy in particular. But these issues have been around for a long, long time. And the screen here's got an analysis really going back over the last 10 years. I could probably go back further, but 13-14 was the year in which police and fire transferred to Scottish Government. So figures prior to that can be a bit misleading for comparison purposes. But if you look at the top line and then the bottom line. So you can see quite a significant increase in funding, cash funding for local government over that period. But the bit in yellow at the top is what it really argues the core funding. And you're seeing increasingly specific grant for specific policy areas and funding within other government portfolios are largely responsible for that, what appears at face value, and then calling for a significant increase in cash resource. I think the key for us is the top figure, which is what we've spoken about as core funding, and that's to provide the funding for the ongoing council services, that wide range of services that councils provide. So I think that is one of the main reasons, I think, why you get this difficulty in understanding the figures, why I've called them slightly misleading in the context of how councils are funding and the directed funding, as opposed to funding that's more flexible in terms of councils having discretion over how the money can be spent. And 10 years is a heck of a long time to see effectively a flatlining of that funding. I'll talk a bit more at some of the challenges that's been presented. The other big area to think about is the funding for local government in comparison with the Scottish Government budget as a whole and the funding for health. Now, those of us like me that have been around for a long time can go back a decade to a position where local government and health were broadly received about similar percentage funding. Round about a third of the Scottish Government budget went to local government and a third went to health. But you'll see on the screen here that trend over the past 10 years where you've seen a reduction in the proportion of funding going to local government and expansion in the funding going to health. And I think there's something Sheila touched on in her presentation as well. One of the difficulties COSLA has been highlighted is that you need a whole system approach to improving the quality of health in this country. To me, there seems a focus, and I could probably aim this criticism as much as the UK government as the Scottish government. There's a direct issue about funding health service directly and not recognising the wider underlying causes of health. And a lot of that falls into the areas of service that both local government and the voluntary sector provide. So I'm talking about education, housing, childcare, employability, leisure, culture. These services all provide a significant role in preventing poor health outcomes and reducing demand for the healthcare services. And I think just before Christmas, and it's in the news this week, I think there was just before Christmas an announcement that said something like 1 in 6 people that are currently in hospital don't need to be there, but they're there because there's no provision within the wider care sector. And that, to me, is a direct result of this lack of investment over the years. We're not spending enough money on prevention. Everything has been frontlined into the health service. And whilst I totally understand the pressures that health services funding, we do require greater investment in services upstream to prevent that increasing demand on healthcare services. So with that context of a reducing proportion of Scottish Government funding going to local government, that flat lining of the core funding for local government, the wider context again is looking at what's happened over the last 9-10 year period. We've seen an increase in population, particularly in the over 65 population, increase in the number of households, increasing complex care needs, pay pressures, inflationary pressures, and then new policy areas that we've seen as part of that as well. So there's a real challenge, and I think what we've been arguing for very much is there need to be a dialogue about pressures. Sheila spoke about fair funding for the voluntary sector, and that echoes exactly what we've been saying about local government. that if you completely focus on the current position, the current challenges, then you're not addressing the underlying problems. So what does that mean for the voluntary sector? And so last slide here really is saying in terms of the spending plans of Scottish Government that were published May last year, looked at a sort of flat cash settlement for councils over the next 3-year period. And against that background, significant increase in costs, increased demand for services. It does really stress that councils are really going to struggle to maintain even the range of services that they currently do. And it's difficult to see how much manoeuvre the Scottish Government has within that context. And similar to point other speakers I made earlier, a big proportion of that funding goes on staff costs. So I do feel it's inevitable that there'll be further reductions in staffing levels, and that's going to mean poor services for the public.
You've got about a minute left, Derek.
Yeah, just in conclusion, as it's difficult for me to predict decisions that were made at individual council levels, but in that funding context, I think we are likely to see a focus on core activities, which is going to place pressure on funding for the voluntary sector without a doubt. I think single year grant announcements don't help that long-term financial planning, and it's likely to mean that councils will be unable to provide that multi-year funding certainty to voluntary organisations as well. And I do fear that cuts to council core budgets will hit the most vulnerable in our communities the hardest. So it's a pretty gloomy picture, I'm afraid, echoing what others have said. But I'll leave it at that, Paul, and happy to answer any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was fantastic and really helpful to kind of get that sense from how things look at from a local authority perspective. So we're going to move now on to some Q&A questions. We haven't had too many come in. So I don't know if I don't know if Douglas, if you would like to ask your question direct to the panel by coming on, by unmuting yourself and talking, or I can put it to them if not.
No, that's fine, and it's a bit long-winded. But firstly, it was thanks to the speakers. I think it was a very honest overview of where we are, and which is not very encouraging, I suppose. My question is, and it's a very hard question to answer, no, but I mean, a bit like Derek, I've had 30 years in local government and now in the voluntary sector, and it's just pretty depressing. It's the budget settlements are obviously extremely difficult and challenging and will lead to significant cuts across the board. But for me, there's a political stupor which has been long-standing, and that's local, regional, and Scottish and UK level in my view. And I just wonder if maybe Mairi may be best placed to advise. Is there any hope that there's some real serious consideration taking place in Scottish Government or elsewhere at the significant challenges? I know we talk about the impact of COVID, cost of living, Brexit, clearly, but some of these issues, the funding issues, are long-standing for years and years and years. And you know, we've talked about public sector reform, we've talked about changing this and that, and to me, very little has changed and very little is being addressed. So I suppose, I find it all very depressing, I have to say. But I just wondered, is there hope? I don't see much sign in the Scottish Government of real, and this is across the political spectrum, please note that. There's a political stupor. Nobody's really taking these things seriously, looking longer term about the challenges facing the country, how we might begin to address them, recognising that there's not going to be a budget cure coming anytime soon. But you know, we've kicked the can, as Mairi said, down the line on so many things, year after year, for over a decade, probably more. And I just would like someone to say, oh no, but somewhere in the ether, there's somebody seriously considering challenges, whether it's a local government or health or the social economy. Because what we do seem to get So this is my last point, is we get things like the National Care Review, which come top down, ill thought through, and don't work. And this won't work. And there's other examples of that. So I suppose I'm looking for some encouragement that somewhere is really seriously looking at issues and looking at serious reform and how we might address the challenges facing the country. And I know it goes beyond Scottish government and into UK and international, I suppose. But so sorry, long-winded. And
thanks, Douglas. No, that's great. And I probably would align quite closely with that view, which is really disappointing. But let's hope that Mairi can give us something a little bit more positive, perhaps.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard not to get quite frustrated by the lack of long-term thinking, and some of the you look at the spending review and the discussion in the resource spending review about the need for public service reform and efficiencies and doing things differently. And when Kate Forbes was asked about it at the time, it was like we were back in 2011 and discussing the Christie Commission, and he comes round again. And if you're in the sort of, I suppose, any public sector policy space for a while, you see these things sort of cycle round again. It's like, wasn't this what we were supposed to be doing all along? The Scottish Government are fond of pointing to things like the National Performance Framework and the focus on outcomes, and the idea of that obviously is to focus on the things which are going to achieve long-term outcomes in the most efficient way possible and not short-term political goals. But despite that rhetoric, you don't really see much evidence of that in the policies that are being pursued. Even the more recent National Strategy for Economic Transformation, which didn't really mention the National Performance Framework very much, that was supposed to be about a 10-year strategy for economic transformation, but in the delivery plans published recently, it's not very inspiring that they're actually going to look at doing anything different. And indeed, on things like a fair and more progressive society and reducing poverty, they're focusing on things which, like employability services, which they then cut in the emergency budget review. So, it's hard to be optimistic that there's a really willingness to grasp the nettle on difficult long-term decisions to do things in a more innovative way. To me, there's too many sacred cows in the Scottish policy landscape that just can't be talked about. And linked to David's question as well about revenue raising, I mean, how we tax wealth, and within the devolution settlement, actually dealing with council tax once and for all, when we all know what problems are with it, is something that's in the Scottish Government's gift to do if they only had the political courage to do it.
Thanks, Mairi. Is there anything that Derek or Shelley might want to add to that very briefly? Because I want to get on to some other questions. If people do have them, please do put them in the chat.
I mean, very, very briefly, I would agree with what Mairi said. To me, there needs to be a fundamental review of how the public sector is funded. And some of the sacred cows, to pinch Mairi's expression, I do think need to be up for grabs. I think what's not widely recognised is the impact of Scotland having its own devolved tax raising powers, because there is something called the block grant adjustment, and because the Scottish economy is not performing as well as the UK as a whole, it means a significant proportion of that additional tax has been going to offsetting a reduction in grants. So Scotland is not actually benefiting from to the extent of which it's generating additional tax revenues. To me, there needs to be the big elephant in the room is the NHS, and as long as you have the press focusing on the NHS the extent it is at the moment, I think it's very difficult for politicians to move away from that. But I think there has to be a fundamental review of how public sector is funded, because there literally isn't the level of resource needed to deliver the range of services that we have at the moment. And I see precious little sign of it. The one slight glimmer for Douglas is that COSLA is working with the Scottish Government just now around a fiscal framework going forward. Where that will take us, I don't know. Progress has been pretty slow so far, but I'm hoping that at the very least it will lead to a better understanding and earlier decision making of the challenges facing local government as part of that process. But like Mairi, I'm not overly hopeful that we're going to see dramatic change anytime soon.
Thanks, Derek. And anything from you, Shelley, on that one?
I guess even though I've been, quite doom and gloom in my talk, I actually do feel a bit hopeful for the next year, but maybe I'm just in some ways an eternal optimist. I think the Scottish Government keep asking for solutions that won't cost money. And I think for voluntary sector funding, we give them a lot of solutions that won't cost money, multi-year funding, timely payments and decision making, improving funding transparency. They've got lots of projects to do with funding transparency going on right now that they could try and accommodate voluntary sector funding into. So although I'm really doom and gloom, I think maybe there could be progress on some of the processes over the next year. Or I hope there could be. And I feel like discussion around multi-year funding is still pretty high on the agenda, and I know it has been for a while. So that it still is there does give me some hope that maybe there could be some changes around process, although on some of the things like uplifts and the things that actually cost money that the sector so urgently needs, I don't feel as optimistic about some of those things.
Thanks, Shelley. Yeah, and we have started to see a few more organisations get in touch with us to say that they have started to receive multi-year funding, and we'll just kind of keep an eye on that. But definitely, I think this year it's about holding government to account on those promises. I'm going to go to Kim, and I think we touched slightly on David's question, but if not, then please let me know, and I'll come back to that. But I'm going to go to Kim because I didn't pick Kim's question yesterday on the other webinar we were involved in. So Kim, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Paul. Sorry, I'm unwell with COVID, so I was hoping you could pick that up for me. So apologies while I try and get my brain to function again. I think it touches on what Shelley was saying about, there've been strong representations from the sector about what a flatline budget would mean for the sector and its workforce. But unfortunately, that's still what we've got. So, I guess in my head as a sector, just building on what you were saying, Paul, is how do we up our game a little bit? So I guess the question for the panel is, what do you think the sector needs to do to make sure that these concerns and the reality of these concerns really are understood, that this isn't just about the third sector, my most loathed phrase, but that this is about a huge number of people who are supported as part of that? And do we need some kind of voluntary sector pay deal discussion? I don't know what that looks like. So there's two parts to the question, if that's all right, please, Paul. And sorry, I sound horrendous. I feel slightly better than I sound. Sorry. Yeah,
of course. Can we go to Mairi there?
Yeah, I mean, this has been an area of work for me for a while about trying to demonstrate the economic contribution of the third sector. And we are kicking off a lot of funded research from April, actually, with the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence on these sorts of things. So we've been looking at this for a while, kind of on a shoestring, but we've now got significant funding for research to look at how we delineate the third sector, which is obviously controversial, about who's in and out and all that sort of thing, and how we demonstrate it compared to other sectors, the sort of the real economic contribution, never mind the additional social contribution and the support for communities the sector provides. So whilst these numbers are not the be all and end all at all, they are a good hook for representing to government that, the sector is an economic actor as well as one that can provide services for them when, in a more efficient way and in a way that's more aligned with the needs of individuals and households. So that's something that I think is important, but it is seen as a priority for the UK government through ONS, who are now funding research on this. So I think that's a positive, at least, and it should start to yield more research and figures over the next couple of years.
Derek, is there anything you might want to add to that?
Probably not a lot, actually. I mean, I do think quite often there's too much focus on cash, and there actually needs to think about some non-cash solutions to some of this. And I think it needs that honest discussion about what opportunities that there are. As I said, whilst I do believe we need sort of funding decision, there's too much short-termism. We need to think longer term, and I think that probably the election cycle doesn't help in that. Politicians need to be thinking longer term as well for us to find some solutions to some of these challenges.
Thanks, Derek. That's great. I'm conscious we've got 5 minutes left. And I would just say on that is the SCVO this year are going to be really ramping up our work on the sector's role as an economic actor. So really pleased to hear about that work, Mairi. I know my colleague is involved or in discussions with you. We've got 4 minutes left. David Fryer, if you could be very brief with your question, we might be able to fit it in with a response.
Yes, hi. I'm a charity trustee in Torry, Aberdeen. I'm sorry to put it in an old-fashioned way that I've seen over too many years. We're still treated like a Cinderella service. We're often still seen to be those wonderful people who can get things done quickly at next to nothing. And we bail out big organizations where they fail. So given the time we've got ahead of us for budgets being made for next year, how can we as a third sector kind of keep raising the profile that we're best placed to help in communities, community organizations? Glad Mairi brought in the point about our own economic activities, wealth building, investing in communities. So what can we do in a limited time that maybe can just up the profile, that the third sector is a real player and it can't be treated in the way that's been expressed today, short-termism, have a bit of money, but you get by for 6 months, 9 months. We know the story. I'll stop there. You said keep it brief. Sorry, I went on a bit.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. And I think we saw a lot of that in the pandemic, didn't we? Recognition for the crucial role the sector had played, but we are hearing now that it's kind of slipping back to old ways, slipping back to old types of relationships with the public sector. Derek and Mairi, is there anything that you would want to kind of quickly chip in there, 30 seconds to a minute?
I think the point's very well made. My previous experience working within councils, I think that is recognised, and I think increasingly we would see the need for community to take greater responsibility in the delivery of services at a local level, to focus on what the local priorities are, rather than what's currently happening is probably policy direction top down, and different communities face different challenges right across the country. So I think local solutions is something where we would see a real need for focus going forward. Government have spoken about that in the past, but I don't really see much at the moment happening in that area. But there are some very good examples across the country of what's happening at a local level, and I'm not sure that's always appreciated. So anything that can be done to promote that, I think would be a really positive.
Thanks, Derek. And Mairi?
Yeah, as a trustee of a community organisation myself, I sympathise with that. And I think in terms of sort of Shelley's optimism, I think both with central government and with local government too, in my experience, there needs to be a willingness to give up control in order to allow community organisations and third sector to deliver services in the best way, and also therefore not to be willing not to take the credit for success. And that's where I'm most sceptical that the Scottish Government and local government to a certain extent are prepared to do that.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you to all of our speakers today for coming along and giving us those presentations and answering some of those questions. And thank you to everyone else who joined the call. And I can't believe we finished on time for a second webinar in a row. But it's been any questions that will come through the chat. I think there might have been one that we didn't get to, then we'll get those responses in writing circulated round. And I think all that there is left to say is that you can find out more about SCVO's policy work at scvo.scot/policy. We've got between 8 and 10 inquiries, bills and consultations going on between January and April. So there's plenty to get involved in, not least the charities regulation reform bill and plans to extend FOI to the voluntary sector as well. So do take a look there. But thank you very much for coming along today, for giving us some of your time. For some of you, it will have been your second day back. I hope it has energised you and not depressed you too much. But SCVO will continue to push for fair funding over the coming year, and always keen to hear your views on how we can do that in a better way and a stronger way, and hopefully get some real change this year. We'll remain optimistic because we need to remain optimistic as a membership body. Thank you, everyone.